everyone, and welcome to Books in the World. Today we have a treat in store. We're going to talk to Chip Bishop. Hello, Chip. How are you?
How are you?
Good, good. Quentin and Flora, a Roosevelt and a Vanderbilt in love during the Great War. This is a story about the son of Theodore Roosevelt and his fiancée during the years, early years of World War I, and it's about his growing up as a White House child of Theodore Roosevelt. I think you'll enjoy it. Before we go any farther into talking about the book, I want to give it a big shout out. It's a great read, and it brings together history and romance, morals, immorals, people who were tremendously wealthy, people who are tremendously dedicated, all into one story, and of course the horror of World War I. Chip, you're a Cape Cod author and nephew of the historian who wrote about Theodore Roosevelt. Is that?
Yes, I washed ashore about 18 years ago, so I'm getting close to being a Cape Codder. Yeah. My great-granduncle, Joseph Buckland Bishop, was a great pal of Theodore Roosevelt's.
Now, not everybody can say that.
Right. They wrote 600 letters to each other over 25 years, and Uncle Joe ended up being Theodore's authorized biographer.
You know, having just read your book, this one, I can't imagine anything more thrilling than to be Theodore Roosevelt's friend. I mean, what an interesting man. I said this to you earlier today. I don't think we know enough about him as a man, at least those of us who perhaps only studied about him in high school, or maybe a smattering in college. So before we go on with our conversation, I just wanted to give the listeners a flavor for the book in the words of one of your readers who wrote this comment. And it says, one reading Quentin and Flora is reluctant to read the final chapters since he knows the sad outcome ahead and because he doesn't want such a fantastic book to ever end. If the story were fiction, it would not be credible, but it's real. It has everything: famous but philosophically and morally opposed families, a love story, success and tragedy, war and heroes. The lift given to our country by the rambunctious Roosevelt kids moving into the White House following the McKinley assassination and the military honors accorded Quentin by his enemy are only two of the many events that will resonate with readers. Chip Bishop has masterfully recorded this story based on his painstaking perusal and interpretation of letters by Quentin, Flora, and their friends and family members. Does feel good.
That was pretty nice.
Pretty nice, doesn't it? So we can start, I think, with Theodore Roosevelt, and as I mentioned to you, the fact that he was such a wonderful father and a husband and a family man is something that certainly is not something that I knew much about. Can you talk about Theodore a little bit?
Yeah, he's really one of the great figures in American history, and is considered one of our great presidents. He's the only 20th century president on Mount Rushmore. And he was our president between 1901 and 1909. But that was really only a small part of his life. He had served, of course, as vice president and became president when William McKinley was assassinated. He had been governor of New York. He had been a Rough Rider during the Spanish-American War. He had reformed civil service as a commissioner in Washington. Of course, he went on one of the great safaris with the Smithsonian Institute after his presidency, and is being increasingly recalled now as the explorer who sailed down the River of Doubt near the Amazon River after his presidency as well. So he crammed all of this into 60 years. At the same time, he raised 6 children, was married twice, and wrote about 150,000 letters in his lifetime.
Well, writing letters is certainly part of your book. People wrote each other almost daily, I think, and luckily you had the opportunity to read the letters between Quentin and Flora, and I'm sure many of the Roosevelt letters as well. What would we do if we didn't have letters at this point?
I don't know what future historians are going to do without letters. I suppose we can get thumb drives and peruse those for people's emails, but there's nothing like holding and reading a letter that somebody sat down with pen in hand and wrote, because it allowed people the time to be expressive, to be honest, to be sincere about what they were saying. Who knows how much of that exists today in our haste to send emails around to each other.
Yeah, do we really think it through, what we need to say?
A lot of times we regret what we've said in emails and wish we could pull them back.
And people saved them. Flora saved his letters. You made a comment in your book that he also saved her letters. Were you able to see them?
Yes, there were fewer letters coming into Quentin because, well, guys just didn't save letters as well as women did in those days. And of course, Quentin was on the battlefield and not exactly the kind of environment that encourages the preservation of letters. But we certainly have enough to understand the two-way conversation that was going on across the Atlantic Ocean at that period. There are about 125 of the letters in existence. They were donated by their respective families, and they are part of the Theodore Roosevelt collection at Harvard University.
So these young people were only, Quentin was only 20 when he died, so they wrote pretty regularly.
The story really occupies about 2.5 years of their lives in terms of the correspondence. They became social friends when Quentin was a freshman at Harvard and Flora was at home. But that relationship deepened over time, and you can see it evolve as you read the letters chronologically from boy-girl friend into lovers. It's amazing evolution. And, at times I felt a little guilty about intruding into their personal lives here, but I thought, well, if their families didn't want them to be public, they would not have donated them to a public institution. Yeah. So I took a deep breath and felt better about that.
Well, your book doesn't have a sense of voyeurism, though. If you read things that were intimate, that touched you, you put it across in a more neutral way in your book, I think.
I tried to do that.
Try to tell the story without, being sensational about it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that reflects the tenor of the times. I mean, this was 100 years ago. It was post-Victorian in the Edwardian age. And people did not speak then as frankly as we speak today. A lot of it was in sort of code of the time. So you can draw your own conclusions about their relationship and how it evolved, but they were genteel people.
Yes.
And they wrote elegantly in their letters, and it gives you a nice, warm feeling in reading those letters.
Well, let's go back and set the scene of the Gilded Age and talk about Flora's family, the Vanderbilts and the Whitneys. And I liked the fact that you brought in the Cole Porter lyric. There's a lyric in one of his songs that says, "You're the top, you're the Whitney stable."
Yes.
So probably before reading this book, I might have heard the song 200 times and never really knew what that lyric meant, if I ever. But as you say in the book, and you're quoting someone else, the rich worked hard at their pleasures. So this was a family that had the money of Cornelius Vanderbilt to start out with. Can you fill us in a bit about that?
Flora was the great-granddaughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt, Commodore Vanderbilt, who was one of the great early American merchants. He built the New York Central Railroad, and he built the original Grand Central Station. And he, at one time, was the second richest man in America. That was only one side of her family. That was her mother's side. Her father's side was the Whitney family. which descended from a number of industrialists of that period that made enormous sums of money as well. So she was well positioned to be very comfortable for the rest of her life. She grew up in the storied mansions of Fifth Avenue in New York. And in summers, she was at the Breakers in Newport. And those of your viewers who've been to Newport to tour the Breakers know the kind of extravagant lifestyle that involved.
Right. Didn't her mother get married there? I think you said in the book.
Yes, she did. I don't know whether Flora might have, had it ever come to pass, but she was also a young woman who was rejecting a lot of that. She and her mother both felt that there was a greater role for women in the Gilded Age than just being the daughter of somebody wealthy. They needed to stake out their own place in society. Her mother was a very famous sculptor and a good sculptor. Flora, it was not clear yet at this point in her life what she was to become, but she played a major role in developing the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City, which is one of our great American art institutions. And if it weren't for Flora Payne Whitney, that museum would not exist today. She almost single-handedly funded it in its middle years when it was struggling financially, and made sure that it was on firm financial footing.
And it started out from her mother's personal art collection. Her mother did have the means and the interest to find American artists and collect their works. So
yes, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was dedicated to American artists. This was the period, of course, when America was appreciating the great art that was coming from Europe.
Yes.
But we were neglecting American artists. They hadn't really been discovered. And Flora's mother dedicated the early years of her life to making sure that there was a showcase for American artists, and thus the Whitney Museum.
Well, back to Quentin. In face of the fact that these two got together and their families were very different, he came to public attention when he was a little boy in the White House. His father was a man full of purpose and heroic thoughts and very scornful of this wealthy class, and did a lot of trust busting, as you describe in the book. But I liked the way Quentin is described as such a decent, hard-working, dedicated kid, and they sent him to public school. That's come up in recent years, whether the children of presidents would ever go to a Washington, D.C. public school. I have a quote here about someone who asked him, how could he get along with those common boys? And Quentin, shaking his head quizzically, responded, I don't know what you mean. My father says there are only 4 kinds of boys: good boys and bad boys, tall boys and short boys. That's all the kinds of boys there are.
There you are. Well, his parents wanted him to mix with the working class when they were in the White House. They knew that in later years he would go to elite private schools. He would go to Harvard, as did all the Roosevelts. So they wanted him to have a good grounding and to meet working class families. And from that environment, he formed a gang which was known as the White House Gang. And these were 7 boys about, I don't know, maybe 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, somewhere in that range, who he went to school with. And he would have them over to the White House all the time. Because why not? You know, your father's president, so you have to invite your friends over. And they would have the greatest time marauding through the halls of the White House, reenacting the Spanish-American War with their fake swords and pistols. And there's one story that I particularly like. One time of an evening, Theodore was strolling through the halls of the mansion, and he gazed up at Andrew Jackson's portrait, and he noticed that it was covered with spitballs. Well, the president figured out pretty quick who was responsible for that. So he went to Quentin's bedroom where his buddies were having a sleepover, and he dragged Quentin out of bed, and he said, what would you say if somebody threw spitballs at my portrait? And ever quick to respond, Quentin said, you wouldn't mind a bit. And besides, Andrew Jackson is dead.
He was very straightforward. That comes across even later on. And I'm looking again at the picture. What a charming, charming looking person he was. We were talking about how popular he had become as a boy in the White House, and you wanted to read a section about a visit that he and his father, this is on page 58, he and his father took to Cape Cod, actually.
Yes, I believe it was not the only visit that Theodore had to Cape Cod. He had come hunting here, and actually in the Mashpee Woods at one point. But his most well-remembered visit was in 1907. And I can read a short excerpt from the book which recounts what happened, because Quentin was with him at the time. Quentin enjoyed most of the perks of being a presidential child, including the opportunity to travel with his father's entourage from time to time, and to experience the attendant pomp and circumstance. Quote, almost with the dawn of the morning sun, Provincetown was astir, and out to watch for the presidential yacht Mayflower with the president on board, a town newspaper reported August 20th, 1907. And there she was. It was just 9 o'clock when a little tinge of black smoke far off on the horizon proclaimed her coming. It was a glorious sight, said the newspaper. Quentin surely watched in awe from the deck of the Mayflower as it passed through a ceremonial lane in Provincetown Harbor, flanked by no less than 8 battleships, decked out with colorful flags raised in tribute to the commander-in-chief. As a 21-gun salute boomed, the President, First Lady, daughter Ethel, and Quentin walked the pier in boarded open carriages for the ride through town. They drove past 1,500 Marines standing at attention to the top of Town Hill, where TR would preside at the groundbreaking for a tower marking the Pilgrims' first landing in America. There were cheers aplenty for the popular president, and more than a few shout-outs for Quentin. At 9, going on 10, he had achieved a celebrity status of his own, even on the remote outer tip of Cape Cod. So,
we don't think about the times when there wasn't a Pilgrim's Monument in Provincetown. So he goes on and he goes to college, and he had a very strong interest in mechanical things. He thought about becoming a flyer, or he was interested in airplanes. The airplanes it was a very early era for airplanes. I'm jumping ahead in my thinking, but one of the things that struck me is when he does actually go into World War I, he has, first of all, they have to find planes for them to train in, and they have to find flight schools, and it's a very early time for all of that. But he decides he wants to go to the war. I am jumping around because that point struck me, but just to back up, he is encouraged by his father, and maybe you can pick it up there. His other sons are already in the war.
Yes, his father was actually the first president to fly in an airplane.
Really?
Of all things. And Quentin had a fascination with flight from the time he was about 9 years old, when his mother had taken him to Europe on a vacation, and they went to an international air meet at Rouen and saw these amazing young men in their flying machines doing all sorts of acrobatics and aerobatics in the sky. And Quentin knew, I think, from that point on that his place in life was to fly airplanes. And he reinforced that with a natural mechanical bent. He loved to take things apart, whether it was bicycles or small engines or anything that moved mechanically. He could master that. When America entered World War I in April of 1917, Quentin left Harvard. He was a freshman then, and he signed up for service with what was the forerunner of our Air Force. It was called the U.S. Air Service at the time. And he learned to fly on Long Island, where his parents had a place, and took further training when he got to France. But you're right, America did not have any airplanes at the time. They had no trained pilots to speak of. They were relying solely on the French. But he mastered the art of flying. He was a bit of a hot dog. He loved to do daring things in the sky. He had more than one crash landing when he was learning to fly. But that was all in the great spirit of that era. Those young flyers were the athletes of our time. They were the people that people looked up to.
Well, heroism in war was a big theme in this book, and a big theme in Theodore Roosevelt's life. And he was, in a way, he was pushed emotionally to try to become a hero. One of the quotes that I picked out, it said, he said, "It's rather up to us to practice what Father preaches." So he has two brothers already in the war, or three?
Three brothers.
Three brothers. Yes. Four of them are going into battle. I don't know if we still do that. Do we allow four people from one family to go into war?
I don't think we do anymore.
Yeah,
but in those days, especially if you were the sons of Theodore Roosevelt, you were welcomed to the front. Yeah. And two of his brothers, Archie and Ted, were actually in the infantry with the American Expeditionary Force during World War I. And it was in the Roosevelt blood to do this. Theodore had been an assistant secretary of the Navy at one point in his life. He had built up the fleet to the point where it became a powerhouse in the world. He, of course, gained his greatest fame as a volunteer Rough Rider during the Spanish-American War in Cuba. So Theodore never met a war that he didn't like. And at the outbreak of World War I in Europe, he pushed America very hard to become involved in the war when he learned of the atrocities that were going on in Belgium and France. He actually tried to volunteer to go over to Europe and fight himself. He was in his mid-50s at the time. He was not healthy. And fortunately for him and for us, I think, President Wilson told him no in a White House meeting, that Theodore was a soldier from another century. It really broke his heart, but he was determined from there on that if he couldn't go, then his four sons would carry on the tradition for the family.
Yeah. Well, Quentin gets sent to France, and he works as a supply officer or something like that, and he's more than anxious to get to the front, and his brothers are already out there, and they actually accuse him of shirking his duty and somehow trying to get out of going to the front.
They did. It was one of the rare instances where the Roosevelt family did not hang together. The brothers actually accused Quentin of being an embusqué, which is the French word, or was the French word for slacker. Meaning you weren't doing your duty at the front, Quentin. You were hanging back in the safe rear portions, worrying about supplies and not fighting. That was absolutely not true. And it brought Theodore and his mother, Quentin's mother, Edith, out of their chairs in anger. They scolded their other sons for writing such a letter to Quentin. And Theodore had to step in and referee this family battle. And he sent Quentin a telegram in France, and he said, the only mistake you have made is being too eager to get to the front.
We don't have a lot of time left in telling the story for our interview here, and there are some quite a few things to say, quite a few, just to make sure people know Flora and Quentin tried very hard to get together during the war. There's some interesting facts about the fact that she wasn't able to travel to France to marry him. But then why don't we go to the fact that he did go up and got into battle, and I'd like to hear you talk a little more about what happened when he died, when the Germans buried him. We have about 2 minutes left.
Quentin eventually got to the front in the summer of 1918, just a few months before the armistice was declared. But he had achieved his goal, he had achieved his father's goal of having his great hour of bravery in the skies. He was a flyer, of course, and got into battle in the skies with German fighters over German-occupied France. The story of his demise is a sad one. He was chasing some German fighters at about 5,000 meters above the ground when he was targeted and hit. He was shot in the head in his open cockpit plane, and his plane spiraled to the ground. It fell in France in a little village called Chemray, where Quentin was buried, not alone, but by a contingent of over 1,000 Germans who knew that he was Theodore Roosevelt's son. They had found Flora's letters among his things on the ground. And out of respect for Quentin's heroism, as well as his father's great service, the Germans gave him a ceremonial burial.
Well, I don't know if that was very common. It was basically because he was Theodore Roosevelt's
My
son.
understanding is that it was not uncommon for one side to bury the other warrior. But I think the magnitude of having 1,000 people on the scene was definitely because of his father's reputation. He was known at the time as the most famous man in the world.
Well, I'm really sorry we can't go on for another half hour. I wanted you to talk about Theodore's regret for having distorted the glory of war, but we cannot go any farther with our time here today. We have to read the book. Please go to Chip's website, buy the book online, and let him know. He's going to be at many libraries in the Cape, and on the website you can get the schedule. So thank you very much for coming.
It's been a pleasure.
And good luck with the book and the next one and the next.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.